there, hopefully, everybody. So I will be here, but I'm going to hand you over to Philippa. So Philippa, all yours.
Right. Well, good evening, everyone. It's lovely that you're joining us this evening. I'm absolutely delighted to be able to introduce Mary Bodish this evening. I'm sure many of you will remember the excellent talk we had from Mary on Richard III. I think it was The Monster, the Myth and the Man.
Well remembered, yes.
And I'm fortunate enough to have seen Mary on previous occasions as well. And I'm really looking forward to her talk this evening. We know how well researched everything is, but I have to admit, I didn't know much about tonight's subject. So I'm fascinated to learn about this gentleman who, from the notes that I've read, seems to have been a really lovely man, but also, I would imagine, a polymath, because he had so many abilities. Anyway, without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Mary Bodish, and I'm sure we're in for an absolutely amazing talk. Thank you very much, Mary.
Thank you so much for that build-up, Philippa. Right, ladies and gentlemen, I'm just going to share screen now. I'm just trying to get the full screen picture up for you. It should be coming up now. No, not quite. Let's try. Yes, we have it at last. Good. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining me for this evening's Zoom presentation. It is your privilege to see the debut of this particular talk. I wrote it at the behest of the West Bromwich Local History Society, for reasons which will become clearer as we go along. They wish to mark the 200th anniversary of the death of James Kier, which would have taken place in September 2020. So I got cracking and started writing the talk, but then events overtook all of us. So James Kier has been gathering dust until this evening. I've blown the dust off, I've given you a bit of a shake-up, and I hope that you will enjoy tonight's presentation. Our story begins on the 19th of April, 1708 in Edinburgh. A very young couple have come to be married. The bridegroom, John Kier, is 19 years old, and his bride, Magdalene Lind, is no more than 14. John does have a steady job, though. He's a Baxter, that's to say, a baker, and already a burgess of the city of Edinburgh. Bread and cakes are always going to be in demand here in the largest city in Scotland, and although so young, John Kier is a man of good business prospects. He's marrying into a very respectable family, as Magdalene is the eldest daughter of George Lind, who has been Bailey of the city of Edinburgh. With so young a couple, it's hardly surprising that they would go on to have a huge family. 18 children were born to John and Magdalene, but only 7 of them survived into adulthood. You would think that the odds would be stacked against the last of their babies, who was born on the 20th of September, 1735, and whom they named James. James Kier was to live longer than any of his 10 elder sisters and 7 elder brothers, and he became a scientist, recognised at the highest level, an inventor, and as well a man of letters. But not only did he achieve all this, worthy though this is, he was, as his friend, the engineering genius James Watt, described him, a very agreeable man. John Kier, James's father, died in 1743 before the little lad was 8 years old. Again, this would seem to place him at a disadvantage, but luckily his mother's brothers, his Lind uncles, stepped in. One of them was Lord Provost and MP for Edinburgh, and another was Sheriff of the County of Midlothian. Young James was sent to the Edinburgh High School. Then, seeing that he was highly intelligent, they funded him to study medicine at Edinburgh University. At this time, this was the only place in Britain offering science-based courses, and Edinburgh University was at the forefront of new theories in medicine. There, James met a man 4 years his senior, who was just as lively-minded and sociable and was as fascinated by chemistry as James was. The older man was Erasmus Darwin, and he had been drawn to Edinburgh after studying at St John's College, Cambridge. Erasmus Darwin was to become not only a physician, but a remarkably far-seeing inventor and a poet besides. The two had so much in common that they soon became fast friends. But James Kier was a restless young man and wanted to see the world. While Darwin remained and completed his studies to qualify as a doctor, Kier abandoned his in 1755, and he took up a commission in the army. Aged 22, he joined the 61st Regiment of Foot and saw service in Ireland, Canada, and the West Indies. It was while he was in Ireland that he met Captain Alexander Blair of the 69th Regiment, another friend who was to be of considerable importance to him in later life. Both James Kier's physical and mental strength were considerable. These, combined with his medical knowledge, saved him from an early death when he was on a ship in the West Indies. He was stricken, like many of the crew, with the dreaded yellow fever. This is how his experience was later related to his daughter. From the little window of the cabin where he lay, he saw the sharks tearing to pieces the bodies of his companions who had died of the same disease with which he was suffering. The sea was tinged with blood and their mangled limbs were seen floating on its surface. The army surgeon paid him a daily visit and, observing that he was deprived of the powers of speech and motion, exclaimed sadly, "He is gone too." But he revived a little, and when a person came in some time after, probably with the intention of throwing his body overboard, he made a sign that he wished to write, and a pencil being presented to him, he wrote a request to have a certain quantity of antimony. It was granted to him only from the persuasion that his case was hopeless, but to the surprise of everyone, he recovered. In his mental capacities, Kier was far from being a typical army officer. He rose at 4 a.m. so that he could reread the Latin and Greek texts he'd studied as a boy, and he continued to study geology and chemistry, two of the supplementary subjects to his medical studies, and which had become of absorbing fascination to him. Meanwhile, Erasmus Darwin had firstly tried setting up a medical practice in Nottingham, but meeting with very little success there, he moved, and he was now doing much better at Lichfield. James Kier, now Captain Kier, came to visit Darwin in 1766. He wrote to Darwin, perhaps only half jokingly, saying that he might find a wife amongst Darwin's medical friends in the Midlands. But he was hoping to find someone both beautiful and rich. As he put it, I quote his words, "Some Lichfield fair with more love and money than wit." 2 years later, James Kier relinquished his commission and left the army. It seems that he spent some time in London, as he became a member of one of the clubs that met at the coffee houses that were then so popular in the Soho area of London. The members of this club included Sir Joseph Banks, the naturalist and explorer, and Captain James Cook, and John Smeaton, the civil engineer who pioneered designs of canals and lighthouses. And he also met Sir Charles Blagden, secretary of the Royal Society. But where was the 34-year-old, well-educated ex-army officer to settle? And even more importantly, how was he to make his fortune? For such a clever and sociable man, no doubt many openings would have been available back in Edinburgh. Great centre then of both science and philosophy. Instead, he was drawn back to the circle of friends whom he had met at Darwin's house, and with whom he had found such satisfying fellowship. James Kier scented the opportunities arising here in the Midlands. Not only could he make a good living for himself, but he'd be able to explore and experiment, to investigate, to discuss. Here, he would be amongst young men of his own kidney, who were alight with the excitement of the latest discoveries in science and engineering invention, and who were bubbling with ideas to turn them into practical use in business in this district, where coal and ironstone and fireclay were so readily available. That extraordinary circle of friends became known as the Lunar Society, as they met on nights of a full moon, so that there was light to travel home by. Let's take a look at these men, amongst whom James Kier so quickly found himself at home. We have time for only a brief glimpse of some of them here, but if you want to know more, I cannot recommend too highly this superb book. Firstly, Matthew Bolton, the businessman with the technical know-how. Lichfield was a second home to him, as his grandmother had lived there and his wife was the daughter of a wealthy Lichfield merchant. Bolton's father had a small buckle-making business in Birmingham, which his son entered. And by the age of 17, he had invented a technique for inlaying enamels in buckles that proved so popular that the buckles were exported to France, then re-imported to Britain and billed as the latest French developments. Now, by the mid-1760s, he'd expanded into the decorative arts and moved the business to Soho in Handsworth, and had built himself both a house and the Soho manufactory. There, with his partner, John Fothergill, Bolton made beautifully designed objects of sterling silver plate for those who could afford it, and Sheffield plate or silver-plated copper for those less well off. Bolton and Fothergill invested in the most advanced metalworking equipment, and the works complex was admired as a modern industrial marvel. Benjamin Franklin visited Birmingham from America in 1758 and spent much time with Matthew Bolton and his friends. And Franklin provided a letter of introduction to Matthew Bolton for Dr. William Small, a Scotsman who'd been 7 years Professor of Natural Philosophy and Mathematics at the College of William and Mary in Williamsburg, Virginia. Small had decided to take up a practice in Birmingham, although his real interests were mathematics, mechanics, and chemistry. He soon became not only the Bolton's family doctor, but a great friend of all Bolton's circle, especially James Kier, who, it was said, I quote, loved him with the tenderest affection. In Dr. Small's last illness, Kier visited him constantly and wrote his eulogy after his death in 1775 at the early age of 41. Richard Lovell Edgeworth, lively young Irishman with a genius for mechanical invention, especially to improvements in carriages and transportation. His experiments anticipated both railways and the caterpillar tracks used on military tanks. Dr. Darwin shared this interest in transport and invited Edgeworth to stay at Lichfield in 1766 and thus meet the magic circle. And James Kier stayed with Edgeworth at his home in Maidenhead while he was working on an annotated translation of a dictionary of chemistry. Meanwhile, up in Glasgow, skilled instrument maker James Watt was busy puzzling out how to improve Thomas Newcomen's steam-powered pump for raising water, and succeeding by building a separate condenser for it. In 1767, after visiting London on canal business, on Watt's return journey, he visited both Bolton at Soho and Dr. Darwin at Lichfield. He came again the next year and stayed for a fortnight at Soho, which must have seemed to him a veritable wonderland for a mechanic. Bolton was eager to develop industrial power by using steam engines of the kind that Watt was becoming expert in. And Bolton floated the idea of joining him in a partnership. It was on this visit to Soho that James Watt and James Kier met one another for the first time. Erasmus Darwin moved away to Derby in 1780, so he was no longer present in person very often when the friends met, and Matthew Bolton became the regular host at Soho House. Darwin's place was taken by the Unitarian minister Joseph Priestley, who settled in Birmingham in 1780. Because of the restraints imposed upon them, many nonconformists had engaged in commerce and industry, and thus Birmingham had benefited from their activities. As well as being a noted theologian and prolific writer of political pamphlets, Joseph Priestley was deeply interested in chemistry. His fame rests on his discoveries concerning oxygen, and he also discovered hydrochloric acid, nitrous oxide, carbon monoxide, and sulfur dioxide. He also invented soda water and discovered that India rubber is good at rubbing out pencil marks. At the lunar meetings, dinner was taken in the early afternoon. The wives and children of the lunar friends all socialising together. The ladies would then withdraw and the tables would be cleared, and the plans, the drawings, the scale models and the prototypes would be brought out. The discussions went on late into the night of discoveries and experiments in chemistry, geology and engineering. When either practical help was needed or sound advice was sought, it was to James Kier that the lunar men very often turned. The lunar men also met at Great Bar Hall, the home of Samuel Galton. Galton had begun by making guns in Birmingham, but being a Quaker, when the Quakers embraced the anti-slavery movement, Galton gave up the guns and became a banker. He was seriously interested in science, working on a series of chemical experiments in the 1770s, so he would have had a particular interest in common with James Kier. Samuel Galton's daughter, Mary Ann Galton, wrote a memoir, and in recalling the days of the lunar men's gatherings, she described James Kier as the wit, the man of the world, the finished gentleman who gave life and animation to the party. Kier was looking about him to find a way to turn his fascination with chemistry into a profitable business. He decided to make alkali, for which there was a growing demand for industrial production. He and James Watt constantly exchanged ideas and information on the topic. Kier's idea was to use common salt, which is sodium chloride, transforming it into sodium carbonate by using lime. And limestone is readily available in the Midlands. Firstly, though, in 1770, he took a lease on a glass house at Holloway near Amblecote, and then from there he supplied Matthew Bolton with items like vases and blue glass liners to be encased in Bolton's beautiful silverware. Kier moved into a house behind the works, and it was there the following year that he brought his bride. And yes, she was beautiful, as Dr. William Small wrote to a friend. Mr. Kier has turned glassmaker at Stourbridge and married a beauty. The lady concerned was 26 years old, a gentlewoman, and her name was Susanna Harvey. I couldn't find anything about Susanna's origins in any of the reference works I consulted when preparing this talk. So I decided to put on my family historian's hat and see if I could discover anything about her. I found the entry of her marriage to James Kier on the 10th of October 1771 at St. Philip's Church in Birmingham. Note that one of the witnesses is Samuel Harvey. It must surely be a relative. And I found their marriage license. Samuel must surely be a relative. He accompanied James Kier when he obtained the license to marry his Susanna. So was Samuel Harvey her brother? Her father? I searched in vain to find Susanna's baptism, nor could I find Samuel Harvey's baptism or burial, which led me to suppose that the Harveys could have been nonconformists. However, at the National Archives, I found the will of a Samuel Harvey, a wealthy Birmingham sword cutler who died in 1778. His will was made 26 years earlier, and among his 2 sons and 4 daughters was a girl named Susanna. I feel pretty confident that she was indeed the girl blessed with both good looks and a good fortune, who stole the warm and kindly heart of James Kier. Matthew Bolton, who liked the ladies, was particularly fond of Susanna Kier. He gave her a very beautiful silver coffee pot made at the Soho manufactory. Their first child was a son whom they named John Francis Kier, and he was baptised at Old Swinford Church on the 16th of July 1775. Sadly, baby John died before he was 18 months old and was buried at Old Swinford on the 8th of September 1776. Possibly it was this loss of their only son that led James and Susanna to take a very kindly interest in James Watt's son, James Watt Jr. Mrs. Watt died in childbirth when little James was only about 5 years old, and the boy regarded Mr. and Mrs. Kier with much affection. Gregory Watt, the son of James Watt's second marriage, died in 1804 at the tragically early age of 27. To offer a little comfort to his friend, James Kier wrote an elegy on this young man who had shown great promise as a scientist. In 1778, the Kiers left Worsley. Matthew Bolton and James Watt had so much on their plates at this time that they relocated to Winson Green, so James would be close by to help them in running their Soho businesses for a time. There was some talk about them becoming partners, but it came to nothing. It was while the Kiers were living at Winson Green that on the 17th of July 1780, Susanna gave birth to a daughter. They named her Amelia, and she was baptised at St. Martin's, Birmingham on the 2nd of October 1780. The experiments in the commercial production of alkali were now so successful that James Kier's next enterprise was to go into partnership with his old army friend, Alexander Blair, to produce it commercially. They built Bloomfield Mill at Tipton, and by 1780, their business was producing nitric and hydrochloric acids and red and white lead. The sodium carbonate they produced was especially suitable for the manufacture of soap. The Tipton works eventually covered 20 acres. By the end of the century, they were producing £1 million in weight of soap each year. And that soap made James Kier a rich man, and his technical innovations made the works a showpiece. He was also the inventor of the first fully synthetic process for making caustic soda and an alloy to retard the decay of ships' timbers. I'm not competent to describe in detail all of James Kier's discoveries and inventions and his achievements as a chemist, metallurgist, geologist, and inventor. These were recognised at national level in 1785, when, at the age of 50, he was made a member of the Royal Society. Perhaps even more importantly for us, he was instrumental in the invention of a letter copying machine, thanks to which we have, surviving today, so much of the wonderful archives of the Boulton and Watt collection. Erasmus Darwin came up with an idea for a machine which would produce a duplicate when writing. And the prototype Darwin made was almost certainly shown off at a Lunar Society meeting. James Watt took up the idea. He distrusted the work of Soho's numerous clerks whose sole job was to write out by hand copies of letters that the company was sending out. He talked about this to James Kier, who took up the challenge of inventing a sticky ink using gum arabic, while Watt designed a special press. Letters would be written in this sticky ink. Then a very thin sheet of paper would be laid on the top of the letter, making a sort of inky sandwich. This sandwich would be put in the press and squeezed together with rollers. Then the two sheets of paper would be peeled apart. The bottom sheet would be sent on its way, and the top sheet, which was in reverse but could be read through the thin paper, that was kept on the company files. It did away with the copying clerks and provided a complete set of letters in and letters out in the company files. Matthew Boulton took out a patent for the letter copying machine in 1780, and trading as James Watt and Company, he went into partnership with James Kier to make them. They sold 150 of them to other firms in the first year alone, after Boulton demonstrated the machine at a meeting of the Royal Society. This was, in fact, the forerunner of the photocopier, and versions of their copying machine were used in offices in Britain right up till the 1870s, when typewriters and carbon paper took over. Although most of the lunar men were members of the Church of England and kept up the appropriate conventions of church attendance, the Unitarian Joseph Priestley was a radical who longed for and spoke passionately about freedom of thought. He found much support for this among his lunar colleagues. When in 1789 the French Revolution broke out, most of them spoke out in favour of this overthrow of the despotic Bourbon regime, believing it would gain greater freedom for the people of France. James Kier described it, and here I quote his own words as, "The effect of the gradual illumination of the human mind over a whole nation by philosophy showing that the true end of government is the happiness of the many, and dispelling those baneful prejudices which established the tyranny of the few. But there were many establishment figures in Birmingham who considered nonconformists to be dangerous, especially the outspoken Joseph Priestley. And Birmingham was now simmering with discontent for several reasons. Trade was slack, and the big manufacturers, many of whom were nonconformists, were being heavily criticised. 2 years after the symbolic storming of the Bastille by the Paris mob, Joseph Priestley proposed the founding of a politically active group in Birmingham. Their first act would be to hold a public dinner, tickets costing 5 shillings to include a bottle of wine, to be held at the Royal Hotel on the anniversary, 14th July, to mark this anniversary. Other similar events were held elsewhere in the country, and they passed off peacefully. James Kier was invited to be the chairman of this one. He was to be horrified at what the event was to bring about. The atmosphere in the town was on edge, and the dinner was almost called off, but the landlord of the Royal Hotel persuaded them to carry on. What they dined on, we don't know, but they drank 18 toasts, starting with the king and the country, and including peace and goodwill to all mankind, and prosperity to the town of Birmingham. Hecklers had greeted the 80 or so diners on their arrival, and mud and stones were thrown at them as they departed. A mob gathered, and 3 hours later, furious that the dinner was already over, they broke all the windows in the hotel and then marched straight to the Unitarian meeting house where Joseph Priestley preached and set it alight. What I can only describe as fake news was fed to the rioters, telling them that it was known that the nonconformists were planning to blow up churches and assassinate the king. Priestley's own house was next attacked and destroyed completely. There was little attempt to put an end to it. Someone had hidden the key to the building housing the parish fire engine, and most of the local magistrates regarded nonconformists with disfavour. So began a week in which 4 nonconformist meeting houses and 27 homes of nonconformists were destroyed. 8 of the rioters and a special constable were killed before the authorities brought in a troop of dragoons from Nottingham to restore order. Joseph Priestley, who'd not even been present at the dinner, left the country and settled in America. We're not certain exactly when it was that the Kiers first made their home in West Bromwich, but they moved into a house called Finchpath Hall. They were living there by 1791, as the National Archives holds a certificate of fire insurance from the Sun Company bearing that date and describing James Kier as being of West Bromwich. However, they also lived here at Smethwick Grove for a time, because in 1797 I found in the Poor Law records for Harborne parish, which Smethwick was part, that Mr. Kier was being charged rates for it. He was not the owner, so he probably leased it for a time. The Kiers weren't there very long, as James Kier is not recorded at all in the land tax records for Smethwick at this date. One day in the 1790s, a young Swiss man named Jean-Louis Mollier turned up at Soho House. He was equipped with a letter of credit of £10,000 and, what was arguably even more valuable, a letter of introduction to Matthew Bolton. In his usual friendly and his hospitable way, Matthew Bolton introduced the young man to his circle of friends, and so Jean-Louis Mollier met James Kier, and more importantly still, James Kier's daughter, Amelia. In 1795, he became a naturalised Briton, changing his name to John Lewis Moyliot. In 1801, Amelia Kier married John Lewis Moyliot at All Saints Church, West Bromwich. As she was still under 21, her father had to give his formal consent, and the young couple made their home for many years at Smethwick Grove. The following September, their first baby arrived, and she was christened Amelia on the 25th of October 1801 at All Saints. But earlier that autumn, the new baby's grandmother was unwell, as Amelia, her daughter, tells us that at this time her mother received the sacrament at All Saints while shedding many tears. Less than a month after the happy news of the birth of her first grandchild, Susanna Kier died very suddenly, possibly from a stroke. According to Amelia, James gave one anguished cry, and he wore his wife's wedding ring around his neck on a ribbon forever afterwards. Susanna Kier was buried at All Saints, West Bromwich, on the 25th of November, 1802. As soon as he heard the sad news, Matthew Bolton wrote to his old friend, and in the Bolton and Watt archives survives the letter John Lewis Moyliot wrote in response. My dear sir, the very affectionate manner in which you express the feelings of your good heart on this truly distressing and melancholy occasion calls forth my most grateful thanks. For what can tend more to alleviate our sorrows than the sympathy of those we love and esteem? Mr. Kier, whose affectionate disposition is well known to you, was indeed so much distressed at first that I entertained the greatest apprehensions for his health, which suffered materially. But I have now the satisfaction to say that he begins to become more calm, and I trust that reflection and time will gradually restore the tranquillity of his mind. I could not help communicating to him the contents of your letter, knowing how much he values the affection of his friends. But I will not pretend to express all he felt on perusing it. He was too much affected for utterance. Mrs. Moyliot is, as well as can be expected, the attentions due to her child have fortunately made a favourable diversion to her grief. She joins me in assuring you that nothing can obliterate the remembrance of your truly paternal interest on behalf of this family at so afflicting a moment, and with the most cordial wishes for your welfare and that of your family, I remain, dear sir, your much obliged servant, John Louis Moyliot. John and Amelia went on to have 5 surviving children. After Amelia, always known as Emily, came John Lewis, 1803, James Kier, 1806, Susanna, 1807, Theodore, 1810, and Albert, the Benjamin of the family and a delicate child, born in 1817. All were baptized at All Saints. They were adored by their grandfather. He even arranged for little Amelia's likeness to be added to his own portrait. Their company must have helped a little during the 18 years of his lonely widowerhood. And there must have been many comings and goings between his home in West Bromwich and theirs at Smethwick Grove. By this time, though, the circle of Lunar friends was shrinking. Erasmus Darwin had died in 1802, Joseph Priestley in 1804, and Matthew Bolton in 1809. At the request of Bolton's son, Matthew Robinson Bolton, James Kier wrote a memoir of his late friend and colleague. Another blow came in 1807. While visiting his business partner, Alexander Blair, at his home at Hilton Park near Wolverhampton, James Kier learned that his house at West Bromwich had been destroyed by fire. To save himself from constant toing and froing to his business at Tipton, he'd installed an accounts office at the house. Some of the clerks who worked there had managed to set fire to a beam in the cellar when they had raked ashes out from their fireplace onto the floor. He bore with the loss with great stoicism until the house could be rebuilt. Now, the exciting years of experiment and discovery were behind him, and Kier was living in semi-retirement. There were a few years of reflection during which he wrote a long poem in the form of a dialogue exploring the periods of human life. He outlived all his Lunar Society colleagues. His old friend and colleague James Watt died in 1819. By early 1820, Amelia Moyliot was seriously worried about her father. He'd been plagued by rheumatism in the past and was now suffering from a degenerative illness and seems to have become the victim of a form of dementia. Amelia and her family were planning a long visit to her husband's home in Switzerland, and she wrote of this sad and difficult time in her diary. And she tells us this: "At the beginning of this year, as the time of our departure was approaching, I suffered much on my dear father's account, whom I saw frequently, but He rarely recognised me, and my presence seemed to afford him no pleasure. It was a great comfort to me to see him attended by 2 conscientious and good servants who waited upon him from affection and from duty. The remembrance of their disinterested and faithful conduct is always consolatory to me. In April, the family set off for Switzerland, but before she left, Amelia recorded 10th April 1820. I saw my dear father. While sitting beside him, he recognised me and permitted me to kiss him for the last time on parting. He appeared calmer than formerly, and his countenance expressive of serene benignity. I was overcome with sorrow. Now, one of those faithful servants was helping to console James Kier by reading to him from the New Testament when he was confined to bed. Amelia's entry for the 11th of October 1820 tells us exactly what then took place. My dear father expired on this day at the age of 85. Although he had suffered severely and often from irritability caused by bodily infirmity during his last illness, he preserved a remarkably calm and benign expression of countenance, arising from a serenity of mind which increased as his life drew towards its termination. He then often expressed the wish that he might die without pain in his sleep, and this prayer was granted to him. He was buried in West Bromwich churchyard. My husband and I were precluded from erecting a monument by his particular desire. But the remembrance of his virtues, his talents, and his affections are deeply engraved upon our hearts. The burial took place on the 19th of October 1820. James Kier was laid to rest beside his beloved Susanna. His daughter Amelia could not be there. She was still in Switzerland. As his only child, Amelia inherited all her father's property. The Moylett family left Smethwick for Hampstead Hall between West Bromwich and Handsworth, and then in 1835 they relocated to Aberley Hall in Worcestershire. Most unfortunately, on Christmas Day 1845, Aberley Hall was destroyed by a fire which broke out in the room above Amelia's bedroom. Happily, no life was lost, but the collection of James Kier's books and papers that Amelia had kept were destroyed. And so was the beautiful silver coffee pot, Matthew Bolton's gift to her mother. It's a great pity indeed that the Kier collection was lost in this way. For it would have been studied with great interest and eagerness by students of the Lunar Society and their contribution to the Industrial Revolution. It is, though, thanks to Amelia that we know so much about her father's personality, as some 12 years after the fire, she wrote a memoir of him. In 1868, the memoir, together with notes written by Alexander Blair's son, was put together by James Kier Moylett, James's great-grandson, and published as Sketch of the Life of James Kier, Esquire, with a selection from his correspondence. The article which appears on James Kier in the Dictionary of National Biography is based exclusively on this publication, and that is where you will find more details of his scientific achievements. As an individual, the eminent chemist and inventor Sir Humphrey Davy described James Kier as both an amiable and a great man. But I don't think I could do better to sum up his achievements than by quoting a description I found of him in an article published in the Black Countryman quarterly magazine back in 1979. This is it. A physician who could cure himself, an engineer who was not above being his own mechanic, a scientist who was an industrialist and a businessman, an inventor and a manufacturer, a political pamphleteer and a biographer who could write passable verse. As Amelia Moylitt informed us, it was by his own wish that no family memorial was raised to James Kier. This lack of a memorial at All Saints in West Bromwich has contributed to the fact that the name of this exceptionally clever, kindly and sociable man does not meet with as much recognition either locally or nationally as do those of some of his friends and colleagues of the Lunar Society. I hope that this talk will have helped just a little to remedy this situation. There, ladies and gentlemen, I conclude my presentation to you this evening.
Thank you very much, Mary. Absolutely amazing. As usual, fantastic amount of research that you've put into your presentation. Before I do the vote of thanks, I wondered if anyone had any questions for Mary or any observations. Alan, did you want to ask a question?
No, I'm okay. Thanks so much. Yeah.
I think it seems to me that I don't know how to.
Philippa, you're on mute.
That's better.
You're back with us.
Okay. No questions from anyone? I've just got an observation, really. I just think it's such a terrible shame that the records were lost in the fire at Aberley Hall.
Yes.
And he just seemed to be the most brilliant man. He had so many skills and I mean, a physician, innovator, scientist. I loved the idea of the alkali. I didn't know that, and how important Tipton was. Yes. And the factory there, and obviously making soap must have made a tremendous amount of money. So I mean, that's just brilliant. And everything's so local: Old Swinford, Tipton, Smethwick, West Bromwich, and Hilton Hall you mentioned as well. So I thought it was absolutely brilliant. So I think on behalf of everyone, as we don't seem to have any questions, I'd just like to say, unless anyone wants to come in.
Sorry, yeah.
Oh yes, sorry.
The soap,
yeah.
How important that was maybe to, is it Lord Lever at Port Sunlight, whether they use the same recipe or, you know, other soap makers, something I'd probably look up, you know, because I've been there and heard all about him, and they obviously have all his town to remember him, but you know, it's.
I can't offer you any assistance with that, I'm afraid, on the development of soap making in this country. But I did read an observation that the availability of soap for very ordinary people and its affordability did improve standards of hygiene in the country, and did possibly, in fact, I'd say probably, made a contribution to gradual reduction in the mortality rate during the certainly the early 19th century. Infant mortality was still at a terrible rate for other reasons, but as I say, standards of hygiene were starting to improve on a domestic level.
Yes, yes, thank you.
No doubt in the hospitals maybe as well.
Yes, well, yes.
Right. Alan, can I just ask you, or Sue, I haven't got my diary with me. I just wondered if you could remind us all what the next meeting is, please.
Yes.
Right, okay, bear with us.
It's the
I did a vote of them.
Wales, isn't it? The space.
Yes.
Oh, yes.
Day Tate, space, yeah, the...
Not the title.
yes, let me just see if I've got it
Space
on my
Guard.
phone. Bear with me. June, July. Let's have a look at July. WSS. Don't know whether you've written it on. I've just got down J Tate Space Guard, 15th of
Space
July.
Guard, yes.
Yeah, 15th of July, 2021.
Thank you. Yeah, that'll be another great talk. But I think on behalf of everyone, Mary, I'd just like to thank you very much indeed. I've got 4 pages of notes.
Oh, well done, well done. Yes.
I've really enjoyed it. I mean, being a scientist myself, and I had no idea about the alkali and the sodium carbonate and everything that he did. I had read that he was a chemist. So it was really interesting for me to learn the details of exactly what he was doing. But not only was he brilliant, he just seemed to be a really nice, that's a really silly word, I know, but a truly remarkable but nice person. He just seemed so
warm and so human. I found it fascinating to pick up reference after reference after reference to the warmth of his personality.
He must have been a wonderful colleague to everyone.
Yes,
I would imagine.
yes.
Yeah.
He made that decision that he could have had a remarkably good career back in Edinburgh, but because of his friendship with Erasmus Darwin and meeting the men that had gathered around Darwin, he realised that these were the men he wanted to be amongst and where he thought he could build a profitable future, which, as you see, he did.
He did, yes. Yeah. So I'd like to thank you, as I say, on behalf of everyone. As usual, amazed by the depth of research. But what I love, and I'm sure everyone will agree, you have such a wonderful style of presentation. Make everything so interesting, and the time flies by while we're listening to you. And I actually think we're very lucky to be the first group to have heard an absolutely fantastic talk. So I think we're lucky that was its debut, and I'm sure it'll be extremely popular.
Thank you so much, Philippa. That is so kind of you to describe it like that. I thoroughly enjoyed the research on this talk. I must admit, I was a bit daunted at first because I have no background in science at all, but I thought with sources of which I was already aware that I should be able to build up a picture not only of the achievements, but of the man himself. And I was particularly proud of myself with that little bit of research on Mrs. Kier as well.
Yes. Good detective work.
Yeah. I mean, obviously you do a lot of family history. I've never heard your talk about the Bodish name. I bet that's fascinating as well.
Oh, I've been, when fate sticks a name on you like Bodfish, you might as well find out how that came about. And I have spent now more than 50 years working on it.
Oh, that's amazing. And where have you got back to, if you don't mind me asking you?
I will simply say this, that the name was originally spelt with a T, not a D. It was Botfish. And the earliest reference I have for that, which might be an ancestor, I can't say whether it is or it isn't, is at Macclesfield,
Right.
in a reference to a court hearing on a trespass in 1298.
That's good.
Oh, amazing. Amazing. Right. Well, again, we've really had a lovely evening. So thank you all very much indeed.
Yes. So I'll say good night to everyone. Good night.
Bye. Bye.
Thank you, Mary.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, Joan. Bye.
Bye.
I think I can end it.
Yes.
I have the power.
Yes, you do.
I do. Right. Bye-bye, everyone. I'll see you all next month. Thank you once again,
Bye.
Mary.
Bye.